Chicago School. Okay, so we're a little out of sequence in that we're talking about, when we're talking about Eero Saarinen especially, we talked about his influence from Mies's architecture and the sort of international style. And we're really going to talk more now about what happens with Mies van der Rohe, who, when we kind of left off with him, he was director of the Bauhaus School in Dessau, except that when the Nazis came to power in 1933, they essentially shut that down. They had a very, very negative view of modernist architecture in the international style. And so most of those architects fled Germany. Some of them were Jewish and fled for other reasons too. But they either mostly went to the UK or they came to the United States. And Mies, Walter Gropius went to the US, he went to Harvard. Mies came to Chicago. And the reason he came to Chicago is essentially because he got a job offer at the what would become the Illinois Institute of Technology, which was this fledgling architecture and engineering school that had big visions of growth and development. And they saw an opportunity to hire a prominent European architect to lead their architecture program and also ultimately redesign their campus. And this opportunity leads to, in the post-World War II era, what scholars will call the Second Chicago School. So we talked about the first Chicago School of the late 19th century. It starts in the 1880s and it flourishes in the 1890s and into the 1900s. And it's these Chicago architects really, if they don't create, or if they don't invent certain structural innovations and so forth, they really maximize it. So we out of that emerges the high rise, and it emerges this form, this sort of modern architecture form of what a high rise ought to be. And it evolves and develops, and depending on who you ask, it sort of devolves and becomes something completely different in the 20s, but by the 1930s, there's very little construction and nothing in the 1940s. And so with the economy booming in the 1950s, we start to see a complete resurgence of architecture. And because of people like Mies van der Rohe or Walter Gropius, it is a modernist, almost international style that takes off. And because of other reasons too. Clients liked this architecture because it was relatively cheap and easy to build. And when developers are building a high-rise, they want it built fast and they want it built cheap. And we saw that with the first Chicago School a little bit, but they still was a bit of, okay, a little bit of ornament, not too much. And so the Chicago architects were really good about doing that. But in this post-war World War II era, we don't want any ornament. That's just cost money, and that we don't need that. And so architects like Mies are challenged with, how do you create a beautiful architecture without applied beauty that architects had always relied on? And so a number of firms either are influenced by Mies, or they might have even had people on staff that trained under Mies at IIT or under Gropius at Harvard. And so we see Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, C.F. Murphy Associates, Harry Weiss and Associates, and Eero Saarinen as well, who was not directly educated by him, but was certainly influenced by his work. So we'll start with Mies van der Rohe. And here's a view of him, a very famous photo of him with a model of Crown Hall, which represents really the influence that he has, both as an architecture. People really were blown away by Crown Hall as a design, but also the education that he was teaching so many architecture students coming out of IIT in the 1940s and 50s. And he had this opportunity to design a new campus. This was on the south side of Chicago at about 35th Street and State, in what is even today called the Black Metropolis or Bronzeville. This was right next to the area that during segregation was where African Americans were forced to live. And it was because they were in such a tight quarters and they had a lot of absentee landlords who didn't really care about what the apartments they were renting, as long as they got their rent, it had turned into a slum by this era. And IIT saw this opportunity of revitalizing the neighborhood by tearing it down and building this shiny new campus that would draw people and would, make a better neighborhood. And this was the philosophy of this post-war philosophy in the United States of urban renewal, which is tear down the slums and build something new and better. And we'll see how that develops in a later lecture. So this is a plan that Mies, an early plan that Mies had developed for the campus. And so State Street is right along here. And on the other side of State Street is, shown some, nebulous designs, not really refined yet. All of this developed. All of this is commercial and apartments and so forth, and all of this gets torn down in the 1940s and 50s. The main campus is between State and what is now the Dan Ryan Expressway. And we see that he lays out the campus on a grid system. He takes basically a graph paper and he begins to lay it out very methodically. But one of the things that he does is he doesn't just create blocks of buildings, he creates spaces in between them. You can see that a little bit right here by positioning the buildings offset from one another. And I talked about Mies's design of philosophy before and how he does not want buildings to create squares. He slides things past each other, whether they're walls within a building or, in this case, a whole campus of buildings. And so you flow in and around spaces, in this case, in and around buildings, into smaller courtyard spaces that flow into a bigger space here. And it's very similar to the planning philosophy that Frank Lloyd Wright had developed in his Prairie School houses, of the idea of compression and expansion, both vertically and horizontally. Mies really takes that idea and he really expands upon that, and in the case of IIT is able to create a whole campus of it. Unfortunately, it's only partly realized. Several of the buildings that he had designed for the campus did not get built, and so there are areas that you can go on campus, like right in this area. These buildings were all built and you can walk around in between, almost like a little narrow alley between buildings, and then you open up into this landscaped courtyard and you get a little bit of the sense of what he really wanted to do. But some of the other buildings never got built or got built in a different way after he was no longer the campus architect. But here are a few of the buildings on campus. So these are mostly steel and glass with this distinctive yellow brick. And he expresses the steel structure of the buildings. And this is similar to what he was doing in Europe, but now he's gotten rid of like the white stucco. We saw that in his apartment house at the Weissenhofsiedlung, very more Corbusian, more Gropius and Bauhaus style. He's now emerged to create his own aesthetic, which is steel and glass. And in Chicago, we had a big US steel plant, and we really embraced steel in the United States in a way that concrete was really the big material used in Europe. But here in the US we use steel, and so he really adapted to steel and expresses the structure here on the corner especially, and in the horizontal bands of the lintels or frame between floors. And then he infills that with a little bit of yellow, and then these bands of aluminum windows. And one of the things that Mies always said is the challenge to architects is, how do you turn a corner? The corner of a building is one of the most important parts of a design, or the corner. It doesn't have to be a building, the corner or the edge of an area or a space. And the buildings here at IIT are one of his best examples of doing that. So here we see in the middle is the actual steel column, and then we see these steel beams turned vertically and welded to the column to act as sort of braces for the curtain wall. These themselves are not structural columns. The structural column is just the piece in the middle, but all of these different elements are expressed. And then I even look at the detail of the brick. Notice how it does not come up flush to the steel at the end. There's just a little bit of a reveal. And you can see that almost better. Not only is there a reveal of plane, but see how the brick, there's a little bit of a setback of the brick right here. That kind of little detail is the masterpiece of Mies's architecture. And his famous quote, right, one of his famous quotes is, "God is in the details." And this really is emphasized in a modernist architecture that, as Mies described, is almost nothing. If you have almost nothing, you don't have applied ornament to provide pretty decoration, the details become absolutely critical. And this is where Mies thrived. And honestly, some of his followers failed, right? If you don't have great detailing, your plain building is just a plain building, right? So that was the overall character of his buildings at IIT. But when it came time to design the building for the architecture school, he kind of broke his rules. I had told you before that Mies was not above breaking his own rules and just doing it something different because it worked. And this was a good example of that. This does not fit the grid of the campus that he had laid out. It has no yellow brick to it. All the other buildings on campus that he designs have this yellow brick. It's just pure steel and glass of a scale and proportions that are different than the rest of the campus. But he just decides, hey, this is my building. This is the architecture school. This is going to be the biggest statement of my philosophy on architecture that I can make, and he isn't going to be constrained by the rules he set, 10 years ago, because he's in a different place at this point. And so Crown Hall is one of the most significant modernist buildings in the United States. It's a National Historic Landmark, and it fully expresses the Mises philosophy of what modern architecture ought to be. The structural system is completely expressed. We see these steel columns here that support these massive girders. These are railroad viaduct or bridge girders, essentially, and he's using these on the outside, on the top of the roof. These would be buried right under the roof, inside a ceiling. He's expressing them. It looks like bridge construction. And they support a massive roof underneath that is completely column-free on the inside. He wanted a universal space in here in which the design studios could be moved around in whatever way they needed to be. And he didn't want walls and columns interrupting that in any way. And then he has this travertine podium out front that is the open risers. We've seen some examples of that. And he even initially, in the earliest building photos, didn't even have railings. It was just pure horizontal slabs with no vertical railing interruptions at all. Eventually, the code people stepped up and said, no, you have to have railings. And so there are now the railings on here, but they're still very simple as well. And then glazing wise, he puts a translucent glass down low and a large panes of clear glass up above. And that's to avoid the distractions of the students in the classroom. They get plenty of light coming in, but they don't get to look directly out and get distracted during their design classes. And it creates quite a beautiful effect. I'll show you in the next photo after this, a beautiful effect on the interior. I don't know how many of you have been inside Crown Hall, but if you haven't been to the IITs, if you haven't been to Crown Hall and gone inside, you absolutely have to do that. This is an incredible resource that's available right here, L-Ride array on the green line, or the red line. So here is a detail of the travertine podium and steps that lead up to the main entry. And you can see the railings that I was talking about that kind of interrupt that beautiful, pure horizontal lines. And then the only sort of material introduction into that are these stainless steel doors. Everything else is this black painted steel and the different kinds of glass. On the inside, this is without all the tables and so forth. Normally, it's a pretty messy, crowded space, so it's rare to see it like this. But you see the effect of the trees to create these beautiful shadows on this translucent white sandblasted glass. It's a beautiful effect on a sunny day. You come in here and it's like this becomes the ornamentation, right? If Louis Sullivan was doing organic ornament and was applying it to buildings, Mies van der Rohe didn't do that, but he created the building to allow an organic ornament to occur in this patterning on the glass. It's really exquisite to see that. Then you have this huge plane of a ceiling, and again, no columns. Nothing interrupts this except for two vertical shafts that are necessary for the vent stacks and plumbing stacks and that sort of thing. And this is what Mies calls his universal space. It's column free. You can do anything you need in here. You can arrange things in any way. And this precedent not only works for an architecture school or something, but the idea is that you create this box with an open plan, and it can be anything. It can be a church, it can be a school, it can be a factory, it can be a house or an office, right? And that's what he really means by universal space. So here's a photo of Mies talking to students, and just really emphasizing the influence he has on education for architects around the country, and especially in Chicago. So many Chicago architects emerged out of IIT in the 1950s and 60s under Mies and apply the same architecture to the work that they're doing. So another great masterpiece is just outside of Chicago is the Farnsworth House. This is a residential design for Edith Farnsworth, a very wealthy, successful physician, and she wanted a weekend getaway house. So this is in Plano, far west. We might call it a western suburb now, but this was a little town way out west, and certainly was not suburban at the time in 1952. It sits along the Fox River and is a very kind of bucolic setting. And she had this property. She loved it. She really wanted to, spend her weekends or long, weeks in the summer out here away from the stress of being a high-powered physician. And it sort of off chance met Mies, and the sort of myth or whatever legend is that they had a bit of a relationship together that was more than client and architect. I think there probably was at least some affection between them, certainly by Edith, and that led later a little bit to a falling out, both personally and professionally, and led to a lawsuit actually. But it really created this expression. So what we're really seeing here is his idea of Crown Hall translated into a residence. So seeing just steel and glass, we're seeing just a simple podium. In this case, no railings. Here's a better view of that because there's no code official in the little town of Plano, I guess, in the 1950s. And so he didn't have to put the railings on. This is really what he wanted to do at IIT. And he creates a deck form out here, and then a more covered deck form underneath here, and a glazed wall to enclose the house itself. And the interior has a core for the kitchen cabinets and plumbing stacks and so forth, but there are no walls and there are no columns on the inside. Here's a perfect view of the floating partitions or the floating volumes and so forth. This is a little bit like Corbusier's pilotis. It's raised up off the ground. This was for a functional reason. Mies knew that this site would flood every so often when the river flooded, but he felt, well, if I raise it up a few feet, the floodwaters will just go underneath. Worked fine until we've gotten more and more flooding that is worse and worse. And now every so often, about every 10 years, this house actually floods itself. And sometimes it breaks the glass and the interior gets flooded. So this has undergone a series of renovations in recent years. And there's even a plan to try to put this on hydraulic jacks that would lift the house higher out of the ground whenever there's a flood. I don't think that's ever going to happen, honestly. It's just be too expensive, but the idea is there at least. This is a view more from the backside. Here he paints the steel white instead of the black that we saw at IIT, but the same idea of just pure steel with nothing else. This is like I said, his philosophy. People say less is more. We're not really sure if Mies ever actually said less is more, but it got attributed to him. But what he did say for sure is, the quote is, almost nothing. He wanted to create an architecture that was almost nothing. And this is what it is. It's just the simple structure, a little bit of enclosure, a roof, and the bare minimum of interior partition or walls to create a space. And that's what we get here at Farnsworth. So he actually did very little residential work during his time in the United States, except for bigger multifamily structures. And 860, 880 Lakeshore Drive is certainly one of the most famous. This is from 1949, finished in 1951. View of it. Here's a historic view. So these are two towers set on a kind of a polygonal shaped site right along Lakeshore Drive. And Mies immediately rejects the idea of doing one tower. He positions the two towers in such a way that it maximizes the views that people would have of the lake. That's the winner, right? And that's, you know, if you're renting apartments, that's the view that you can sell your lease or whatever, rent your apartments for the highest lease rate. The backside is going to be a little cheaper. So the more that you can maximize views, the better. And even if you're in this back corner over here in this tower, you still have an angled view out towards the lake, and that's beneficial too. It's not just you know, something to appease the developer. Mies believed, hey, this is a great view. I'm going to try to give people as much of that as possible. And by siting these buildings, and again, they're not just squared off or create a perfect L, they're sliding past and against one another, and that allows this compression and expansion of views and of the use of space here. There's another historic view. This is taken from behind, and you can see the way the towers are, you know, slid past each other. They don't align perfectly, and that creates a lot of visual interest as well. Now this view doesn't exist anymore because there's lots of high rises built behind it and not a big open parking lot. But once again, we have that historic photo with the cool old quaint looking cars that were, of course, quite modern when this photo was taken. In plan, once again we can see what I'm talking about. So here, Lakeshore Drive on the right swoops up on an angle, and so he puts one building back along here, the North Tower, pushed all the way back on the site to create a nice open lawn out front, and the people on the north side, the east side, and even a little bit on the south end have some views out towards the lake. And then the South Tower is turned 90 degrees, and it is not pushed all the way back, because if you push that all the way back, the poor people on the west end of the building, their view would be more constrained. By pushing it more forward, the folks in this apartment right here, they have a clear, unobstructed view out towards the lake. He doesn't want to push it all the way forward, because then the folks in the end of the South Tower here would be limited in their view this direction. So it's a perfect positioning and planning to maximize as many views for people as possible. Here's a view I took looking up between the towers, and you can see how they slide past each other, just like a Kandinsky painting that we talked about earlier. And a view of the interior. Just, you know, Mies is using the pilotis idea again here. He's raising the building up off the ground, and it's just these heavy steel columns that come down to anchor it. And then that is enclosed with an almost transparent glazed wall. This creates just a little bit of an entry lobby. There's a little bit of a solid core in there, of course, for the elevators and stairs and so forth, but all around the perimeter, and that's recessed from the perimeter walls, so it really does look like these towers are floating above the ground. And this is a radical thing, you know, this tall, heavy building, and it looks like it just floats above the ground. We see that a little bit here in the way he does that by setting back the lobby walls and glazing them so that the building comes down with these solid columns. But otherwise, it's very open and the movement in and around at the ground level is fantastic. I love this photo. This is me standing on a high rise looking at his own buildings. People actually asked him once, how come he didn't have an apartment in the 860, 880 towers that were so famous? And he said, I didn't want to be harassed in the elevator by people that were upset with their apartment or something like that. So he actually lived, ironically, in a vintage 1920s era building with crown moldings and dado moldings on the walls and stuff. He had it decorated in his, Miesian, Barcelona and Brunot chairs and so forth, but the background was this highly decorated interior. Perhaps one of his most famous commercial buildings is the Seagram building. This is from 1958 in New York City. So he's beginning to, he's based in Chicago. Much of his work is in Chicago, but he spreads out and does all over the country. And this work in New York really changes the landscape of architecture in New York City. So this is right off of Park Avenue. And remember when we talked about Art Deco and the towers of Art Deco, we talked about how they are stepped back mostly because of the zoning laws that were in place at the time. They didn't want to create these dark canyons, and they thought, well, if we step back the towers as they get higher and higher, that allows a sort of angle of light that can come down and hit the street level. But in, I guess, the 40s or early 50s, the zoning law changed again, and it said, well, you can step back your tower and you can use the whole footprint of your site and you can step back your tower, or you can use part of the footprint of your site and have a tall vertical tower. And Mies is one of the first people to do that and say, oh, okay, I'll try that. And so he creates a large plaza off of Park Avenue, and he pushes the building all the way to the back, and he creates a very, very tall vertical slab. And the idea is that there's enough space left over right here to allow light to penetrate, and you have this light plaza. And part of the idea of the zoning change was, well, we can have these plazas that people can sit in. There would be fountains, there might be trees, and it creates almost like these little mini park spaces in a very dense urban place like Manhattan, which has almost no park space other than the huge Central Park. And so it's a really interesting idea, and Mies takes full advantage of that. And you can see pretty well in this early photo before the other buildings got torn down and did the same thing, is that it creates this really, you go down the canyon of Park Avenue, and poof, you open up into this open plaza space. It was a neat effect when Mies does it at Seagram building. But when this building does it, and that building does it, and that building does it, now you just have this wide, space, and you lose that compression and expansion that Mies was achieving here. So the disadvantage of this approach is that everybody else did it, and it wasn't special anymore. You can see architecturally that the tower is almost the same expression as 860, 880. So he's just taking that and turning it into an office building. We talked again about the idea of form follows function and how the office floors, to Louis Sullivan, the office floors should look alike because they are alike. This is Mies doing the same thing. They're all the same, and you go up and up and up and up until you finally get to the top. He doesn't put a decorative cornice on it the way Mies or the way Sullivan would do, but the top is a little different because it is different. There's mechanical systems all the way up here in the top, and so these are grills and louvers instead of glass, and it creates a cap to the building much the same way that Louis Sullivan had done with the cornice. Here's a view of that plaza, and this is maybe one of the more successful plazas, beautiful fountains in here, and it's a nice space. But again, most of these become windswept and barren, and they're not particularly very nice or heavily used. We can see the same thing he does at 860, 880. He does here. He recesses the lobby walls and glazes them, and essentially raises the building up on these pilotis. There's a nice view of the facade. He uses pretty rich materials here. This is bronze glazing that kind of has this orange bronzy glow for the building, which is a neat effect, especially in contrast with the black painted steel here. All right, and then he does the same kind of thing at the Federal Center in Chicago. Sort of mixes the planning aspect of 860, 880 and the high-rise architecture of Seagram Building, and he creates one of the great masterpieces of federal courthouse architecture in Chicago. Starting in 1964, it actually isn't finished until after his death in 1974. And so here we have a view of the Dirksen Courthouse on the left, and the plaza with Alexander Calder's flamingo sculpture set in the plaza. The low-rise post office is on the right, and then the high-rise Klaczynski office building is in the front. And so this is another masterwork of planning. He creates a plaza, he creates different heights of buildings. That creates a lot of visual interest. If he made them all the same height, boring. So this really creates this compression and expansion, not just horizontally, but he's doing that vertically as well. A couple other views. This is an early view of the Dirksen Courthouse just after it was completed, and you see the building on the left, this beautiful domed, that was the old courthouse. This is the courthouse that Al Capone's trial was held in and all that. Well, that got torn down after the Dirksen building was done, and this became the plaza and the post office. And so this was a kind of a preservation battle, a very early preservation battle. People were sorry to see that beautiful old courthouse torn down, but it's a rare case in which a beautiful old building gets replaced by a beautiful new building. Here's a view of the post office in the front, and you can see what I was talking about, that compression and expansion by positioning the buildings both on their site, but also having some taller, some shorter. He creates a lot of visual interest and space vertically, not just horizontally, and it's a masterpiece of planning that he has accomplished here. And like at the other examples I showed you, the buildings are raised up, at least the two towers are raised up on pilotis with these glazed walls and these solid, massive granite cores on the interior that create a little bit of a sense of strength and power that maybe is evocative of the federal government, or at least the view of we had it in the 1960s, not so much today, I guess. Here's a view of the courthouse. I actually did the National Register nomination for this complex, and so I got to go in some of the courthouses without having to be on trial here. So beautiful woodwork on the interior. We see the glazed, the illuminated ceiling, where the whole ceiling is lighted and not just little individual fixtures stuck into it. And a beautiful view of the Dirksen Courthouse. This is looking across the plaza before the post office got built. This also is a link to another video. I really encourage you to watch this. It's a fun video. You'll enjoy it. So this is on the YouTube page as well. And it was made, I think, by architecture students maybe 15, 20 years ago. And it's Mies's architecture in a music video. You'll love it. I usually enjoy showing this to you in class and seeing your reactions. So check it out and have a little fun with it. And the song will get stuck in your head as well. All right, let me keep going. So Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, this is known as SOM. They're still a firm. They're active and engaged. They took on Mies's philosophy. They actually started in the 1930s and had done earlier work that was a little different, but starting in the post-war period, they really embraced the Miesian philosophy. And I'm going to skip over a little bit of this because some of this is covered in your reading. So, but one of the principal designers is Gordon Bunshaft. He's a lead partner, and he early on embraces this Miesian philosophy and kind of led their New York City office. And so even before the Seagram building was built, SOM and Gordon Bunshaft create Lever House, which is kitty corner to Seagram building. So it's one of the most coolest corners in Manhattan, because you got this masterpiece on one corner and this masterpiece on the other as well. And this is one of the first Miesian international style buildings built in the post-World War II era. And so this sort of, it's not Mies, it's already one of his followers, and it sets the standard for what this new architecture is going to look like. This is a historic color view of it, and you want to see it in color because it's a stainless steel frame, not the black painted that Mies would do, and it has a sort of aqua or green glazed as well. But they take advantage of that zoning law. They push the tower back on one end, and that creates a courtyard space right in here. But the way he treats the base is very differently. And in this more contemporary view that I took a couple years ago, you can see that. So he raises the tower above a platform of offices and shops that are on the ground floor and second floor right here. And there's actually a bit of a roof garden on this upper level, and there's a plaza down below. It's a more successful approach to the plot idea because it isn't just an empty blank space that's, the wind blows down off the building and it's cold and dreary. This is a much more vibrant, lively approach to that, and I think even more successful than the plaza at Seagram building. So here we see on approach down the sidewalk that you'd never feel like you're out of the cityscape. You've got this wall that continues along here, along the street wall, but as you go further along, the next photo, you sneak into this plaza internally, and you feel a little more protected. It's about emotions and the feel that people have. And when you're in this space, you feel a little more cocooned, sheltered, so to speak, for a term we can use today, right? And so you see the trees above you, you see the trees and the fountains right at your level, and it has a much nicer quality of space than the blank open plazas do. And here's a view underneath that, and you can see some of the storefronts and entries into the building itself. And so you have a sheltered space where if it's raining and nasty out, you can be under and you can, sit and eat your lunch out of the rain, or if it's a nice day, you just move over and you sit in the open area with some sunshine. And here's a view looking up from the courtyard at the tower. And you can see this, the approach is the same, the structural grid and so forth. It's just expressed a little differently with a different color of steel and different color of glass. So Bruce Graham is the SOM leader in Chicago, and he also takes the Miesian influence, and perhaps his most famous work is the Inland Steel Building from 1958. And this is a historic view of it. I think this is the view you see in your reading. And I love this because it's black and white, but you can see how radically different this is than the old architecture all around it. Not just that it's stripped of, ornamentation, but that it's this shimmering, literally shimmering stainless steel that reflects the sunlight as a beacon of light that draws your eye in, and compared to at that time would have been dirty, grimy, soot-covered old buildings. It's no wonder that people were really taken by this new architecture, and they said, wow, if our cities could look like this, much the same way that the Columbian Exposition wowed people because they were these bright, shiny white buildings that, in 6 months would have been dark and soot covered, but because it was this temporary exhibition, people just saw them in the beauty of the pure white. This is almost the same effect, but with shimmering stainless steel. So here's a more contemporary view of it, and it's still a beautiful shimmering stainless steel building. Still looks very modern and contemporary, even with the more modern high-rises surrounding it nowadays. It's a more detailed view of that. The approach here is similar to what Mies does at IIT. Graham has these expressed columns on the outside, and then and they're hard to see because it's so high up, but above on the top are girders that support the roof and the floor structures. And so the interior is completely column free. This isn't a big footprint of a building, but it's showing the idea, and here and you can see it in the floor plan, that the office floor plate can be completely column free. So if your company wants the whole floor plate, they can put in cubicles and desks and so forth, however they want to. If you're the developer and you say, hey, I can subdivide this into 3 different tenant spaces, then it's easy. You can put the partitions and the subdivisions anywhere you want to. You're not constrained by the awkwardness of, now I got this leftover column sitting in the middle of my room. Don't have to worry about that. This is really appealing to developers because it's fully flexible. And really interesting here, he puts the core off to the side. This is on the back of the building, so you hardly even see it. And the elevators and the stair and the restrooms, they're all in here. And that allows a completely open, free space on the middle. You don't even have the elevator core in the center of the space at all. And here's how it will look. This is a historic view of one of the office floors, and you can have this wide open space now. This is actually the trend in interior design even today, to have this sort of open benching layout where people can just come in and they don't have their office or their cubicle. They just sit out in the open in their desk space like that. So some of the most significant examples coming out of Chicago, of course, is the Sears Tower, also by Bruce Graham, with Fazlur Khan as the engineer, and this is finished in 1973. So Fazlur Khan is probably the most important engineer of the 20th century. He is born in Bangladesh, but moves to the United States and studies at the University of Illinois, and soon gets a job at SOM, and he just flourishes there. He is such a brilliant mind, and it happens to coincide in this time when SOM is getting these high-rise projects, and he really develops very innovative solutions for how to build what we call super tall buildings. These are the skyscrapers that go beyond the 40 stories that was the height, the limit of the pre-Depression era, into 80-story buildings, 100-story buildings, 120-story buildings, taller and taller and taller, but you got to have a way to support that. And Fazlur Khan comes up with most of the solutions that are still being used today for these super tall buildings. So the Sears Tower is really one of the first super tall building, and was the tallest building in the world for many, many years. I will argue it's still the tallest building in North America, although technically it isn't, but I'll tell you why I think it's still. So what Khan does, Bruce Graham creates the architectural expression, but the building looks the way it does because of Fazlur Khan. And the legend is that his inspiration came from a pack of cigarettes. Hopefully none of you smoke or whatever, but you know how smokers, they'll take a pack of cigarettes and they'll whack it against their hand to get one of the cigarettes to come out. But usually more than one cigarette comes out, and they come out in different, the one that you want comes almost all the way out, and a couple others come partially out. And supposedly he saw that in an ad, or because he smoked, I don't know. And he was inspired by it. He's like, because, at the very top of the building, that's the greatest wind load, and we need to brace that, much the way the Gothic builders had to brace it with flying buttresses. But as you get further and further down, we need more and more of the bracing. In order, at the very base, it has to be really thick, because it's got to support all of the wind, the lateral wind loading for the building. But at the very top, it can be fairly thin, because it only needs to support the wind loading for this segment here. And so he creates what we kind of call the tube effect. And it's beautiful in a way, because he doesn't pull all of these elements up at the same height. He spaces the height visual much the way Mies, breaks up the verticality of the Illinois federal courthouse, or the Chicago federal courthouse, Khan breaks up the layering, the vertical layering of the Sears Tower, and it really creates a more visually interesting building. There's going to be some who probably still say it's a bit of an ugly building, but it's the idea that the structure is guiding the form of the building. So it's that pure form follows function that comes out of Louis Sullivan. This is a great view of it here. Because the Chicago Board of Trade was the tallest building in Chicago when it was finished, and was that way up until like the early 1950s. This is the 40 stories that you could max out at that time. You can see how much taller the Sears Tower is now. It's hard to tell nowadays because when you see the skyline, there's so many buildings that are almost as tall as the Sears Tower that it doesn't look as dramatic, but it looked a lot more dramatic back when it was built. And here's another view of how super tall it is. These are, these buildings down here and here, these are still pretty tall buildings, and you can see just how much taller this goes up and up. This is the structural grid system that you can see on the left. These are the grid plan and the way Khan sort of sets that up to support the wind loading. And they also created these prefabricated grid system for the framing that could be very quickly and easily built, which made this construction of a super tall building much more economical and allow these buildings to be built. And you can see that grid system during the construction photo shown here. So I won't get into this too much, but this is a neat little thing of this is probably already outdated, but some of the super tallest buildings of the world here. And at least at this point in time, Sears Tower was ranked number 10. And the reason I say that it's taller than the One World Trade Center, which is number 3 over here, is because they count this, what they call a spire, right? But they don't count the antennas on top of the Sears Tower. But here's the thing. Look at this. This is the top floor right here of the Sears Tower. You can go up, you can spend, I don't know, it's probably $40 now or something like that, and visit the top floor observation. If you do that, you take your line across, you would be looking significantly down on the roof of One World Trade Center. And in my philosophy, if you can look out your window and you can look at the roof of the building in your competition, obviously not literally because they're not next to each other, but that means your building is taller. I don't care about this stupid spire that looks like an antenna, and they don't count the antennas on the Sears Tower. So that's my philosophy. Sears Tower still is bigger, taller than the piece of crap in New York. Of course, there are other buildings that are literally taller than Sears Tower, so it's definitely no longer the tallest building in the world. The other one that people are more likely to enjoy is the John Hancock Center. Same team, Graham and Fazlur Khan. This time, Khan uses a different approach to support that massive lateral wind loading. And he uses the diagonal bracing to do that, and he expresses it. He and Graham, working together, say, let's express that diagonal bracing, and let's taper it. Instead of the sort of disjuncture geometric setbacks, they just cant the tower so that it's angled as you go up, and then you see the bracing on the exterior grid. This is just a fantastic way of teaching people how these tall buildings are braced against wind loads. And so it's just a different structural approach, and it gives you a different architectural expression, and it's maybe a little more visually interesting. People tend to like this building probably more than they like the Sears Tower aesthetically because of that. Here's a nice view of it from the corner. It's really dramatic. Okay, another firm was C.F. Murphy and Associates. And Jock Bronson was a lead designer out of C.F. Murphy and Associates, and the Richard J. Daley Center here in Chicago from 1965 is a great example of that approach. We're seeing almost the same kind of Miesian Seagram building approach here. What's a little bit different is that he uses Corten steel. Remember, we talked about this with the John Deere Center by Eero Saarinen. So Bronson uses Corten steel for the exterior of the Daley Center. And a lot of people say this is the perfect expression of the Chicago's building, right? This is like, the city, court building, and it looks like a bridge. It's industrial. It's, and you compare it with the Picasso, which is also of Corten steel, and this is like the nitty gritty, Chicago aesthetic. Get things, city that works and all of that is really expressed perfectly in this type of architecture here. And the plaza is a rare example of one that really works. I think because of the Picasso, people love this. They hated it when it first got put in. People are like, what is that? But people have grown to like it. And it's, one of the most famous points in the city. And so people really gather. This is like Chicago's front yard or something, or front porch, and you really gather here. And it's perfectly set against the city county building behind it here as a nice backdrop to that space. And lastly, I want to talk about C.F. Murphy, the theme of Gene Summers and Helmut Jahn. You probably have heard of Helmut Jahn. You should know about Gene Summers, but he's dead and his work is older, but Helmut Jahn is still doing work, of course, in Chicago. And the first big project they work on together was the McCormick Place, what we now call the Lakeside Center, because McCormick has just grown and grown and grown, and so this is just one wing of it. But this is on a horizontal aspect using the bridge technology, these massive steel girders and systems to support a column-free interior space that you can have any kind of exhibition you want. And here's an aerial view of that. And these massive trusses are supported on perimeter columns so that the interior floor area, the whole area in here, can be free. It's a pretty simple approach in a way. And of course, architecturally speaking, it's a little bland because it's just a big giant exhibition hall. But it really worked. And it's just this idea that you can take this architectural approach and you can make it apply to something like a big convention hall. Here's another view of it. And you can really get to see, this is during construction, so you can really see how the space itself is going to be left pretty wide open. Okay.